South Africa's national rugby team, the Springboks, is an exceptional sporting team. They're the world champions, and they're a remarkable team because they're one of those rare teams who manages to unite a fan base, inspire pride and love and hope in all of the people who follow the team, which is incredible and doesn't happen very often at all. They make their fans, all South Africans, feel like they can be the best versions of themselves and that the best of South Africa's potential is harnessed and expressed through this rugby team. But until recently, the Springboks were hated. They were the symbols of white supremacy, racist oppression, and evil. And this is the story of how the Springboks turned from that into a sporting team that binds South Africa together. Welcome to The Issue with Dan Corder, and this is The Issue with the Springboks. Real quick though, it would be super great if you could just go across and subscribe to this channel. We're trying to keep the lights on even as Eskom does everything in its power to turn them off and build this project together. So the 2023 Rugby World Cup is happening right now actually. South Africa is playing and they're doing well. They've only lost one match and they look likely to make it into the knockout rounds. But what has been so amazing this year, for probably the first time in this country's history, is to watch the Springboks thrill an entire nation. If you've been on social media, you would have seen so many South Africans saying, I've never watched this game before, but I'm obsessed. I'm into it. I can't get away from it. And there are a bunch of reasons for this. Firstly, South Africa is very, very good. Secondly, we are the defending world champions. We won the last Rugby World Cup in 2019. But South Africa's been good at rugby for a long time. We won our first World Cup in the 90s. We won another one in 2007. So the question is, what's changed? And I think for many people, the reason is this. From 2019, when that Springboks team won the World Cup, led by the extraordinary captain Siya Kolisi, who has become a world famous person. He's one of those few players who's transcended rugby to just become a superstar. He gets stopped in the street by fans. Gerard Butler, the iconic Sparta actor, is one of his biggest supporters. Jurgen Klopp, the iconic coach of Liverpool, loves him. And he is a deeply grounded, empathic, sensitive, smart, great leader on the field, but also for the public, where he knows that part of his job is to inspire and rally the country. So that was part of the reason in 2019. But another reason why 2019 was so different is that the team was full of incredible players of color. We had Cheslin Colby and Makazole Mapimpi on the wing. We had Lukhanyo in the center. We had the likes of Bongi Mbonambi in the starting pack. This was the first time that the Springboks looked like South Africa. It looked like a team where no matter where you are, where you came from in South Africa, you could find someone who looked like you, sounded like you, came from an area like you, spoke like you in that team, and then they won. And very few people thought the Springboks would win that World Cup. It was a big surprise to lots and lots of pundits, and there was a lot of controversy around picking many of those players of color at all. Because the Springboks, even in their last World Cup win in 2007, were a predominantly white team. And there'd been a lot of controversy in the build-up to the 2019 World Cup because there'd been explicit expectations that more black and colored players would be introduced into the team. And this kind of like sense of like, they're being race quotas meant that some people said, but they're not picking the best players. Maybe they're passing over white players who are better than players of color because of some kind of political motivation, and it's making the team worse. And so it was a massive deal that all of these players of color, when given opportunities, were valued members, match winners. Both of our try scorers in the last World Cup final were of color. It's a huge deal that when given these opportunities, they proved that they were the best and they were part of the best team. And that wasn't the only debate that raged before the 2019 World Cup. There was a huge ongoing public debate about whether or not the emblem, the logo, the Springbok, whether that as the representation of our South African national rugby team should be changed to something else, anything else. And that debate over whether or not the Springbok could ever come to represent and mean something for all South Africans is exactly where we find the tortured, messy history of the South African national rugby team. Rugby was brought to South Africa in the mid-1800s by British settlers, and it was literally known as the gentleman's game, because even in England today you will find that rugby is generally played by very posh, rich, elite schools, darling, that speak like this. So only the very best schools and the most elite, expensive, and for white kids only schools in what would then become South Africa started playing rugby from the late 1800s. There were tours of teams, generally like club teams from different countries around the British Empire. So a British team would come down from London and they'd play like an assembled team from local clubs and schools. And the Springboks, well, they weren't called that then, they started playing in a green kit after wearing one in a particular tour when they adopted the kit from a school in Cape Town called Diocesan College, also known as Bishops. So by the early 1900s, the South African War happens, the Brits win, but they want to create a reconciliation with Boers, with Afrikaners, because they want to build a country together where all white people rule over people of color together. So for the first time, a team, a national rugby team is created to tour Britain, comprised of players who are English and players who are Afrikaans, Anglos and Boers in one team. So this team of white players who would have been on opposite sides of the war land in London to play, and suddenly realize that the British media, the press, the newspapers, often creates incredibly insulting nicknames for teams that then stick. And their team didn't have a nickname, they didn't have a logo, they didn't have a symbol, something to call themselves by. And so in a quick fit of panic, the legend goes that the team got together and decided that they would call themselves die Springbokken, which is like the Dutch. The English version is the Springboks, because it's an antelope that is native to South Africa, and everyone felt good about the fact that this little bokkie could represent what it meant to be from this part of the world. And so they called themselves the Springboks, and we're the Springboks. That's how it happened. So the project of South Africa's national rugby team was fundamentally racist from the start. The green and gold of the Springboks was only for white players and only existed to celebrate white people and represent them in our best teams. And it got even more intense once apartheid started in 1948. The ruling National Party, the Afrikaner Apartheid group, decided that the Springbok and playing for the Springboks and wearing the green and gold would come to represent Afrikaner values of being the best perfect version of a white Afrikaner man. And for the National Party, the Springboks, being a good team and doing well, did a lot of work to prove civilization, that the Afrikaner-led South Africa was worthy of being considered an elite, proper, worthy of respect white nation. No people of color were allowed to wear what was considered the sacred green and gold jersey. It would besmirch it in the eyes of the racists. Then in the 1960s, there was a massive move to get South Africa kicked out of international sporting codes. They were banned from the 1964 Olympics because the world wanted to take a stand by excluding South Africa from sport, and the boycott was wider than that. It was music, it was culture, it was also academic boycott because of the racist Afrikaner ruling party that was so badly oppressing and treating people of color in this country. And South Africa did get isolated. They managed to get 2 tours through for the Springboks, both times of New Zealand in 1965 and 1981, which received heavy backlash and loud protests. And then the International Rugby Board did ban South Africa from all play from 1984 until 1992, which is why South Africa didn't compete in the early Rugby World Cup competitions. And rugby really was the white man's game, particularly the Afrikaners project. Many English young white South Africans played cricket because of the colonial British fetish fantasy that continues to exist in South Africa. As recently as 31 years ago, when South Africa's rugby team was allowed out of isolation because it looked like apartheid was ending, they played a match against New Zealand, the All Blacks, at Ellis Park in Johannesburg, South Africa. And there was racism on full display. People were belting out Die Stem in its fullness, which is largely now seen as a song of pride in the racial superiority project done by the apartheid government, and they were holding up the old South African flag with all of its racist connotations. That was only 31 years ago. Then apartheid ends. Nelson Mandela decides he's going to endorse projects of South African sport to try to build pride. He was seen at Bafana Bafana games, at Proteas games, and iconically when South Africa hosted the 1995 Rugby World Cup. And he was there, standing next to Francois Pienaar as South Africa's captain lifted the Webb Ellis Cup into the sky to crown South Africa world champions. Now, unsurprisingly, in that Springbok team, there was only one player of colour, the legendary Chester Williams. And that's because not only were South Africans of colour not allowed to play for the Springboks or play in whites-only leagues or tournaments during apartheid, they were denied facilities and training and formalised professional structures, which allows for nutrition and exercise that allows people with great talent to turn themselves into world-class players. And as the years went by, there was a small trickle, but it was very slow, of players of colour playing for the Springboks. And the debate raged that South Africa maybe should get rid of the Springbok logo. Not necessarily the green and gold, because that has been widely accepted across South African sporting codes as a colour combo to represent our country. But specifically the Springbok, because of its representation of white supremacy for millions of South Africans during apartheid. And as Springbok rugby teams continue to turn out with overwhelmingly white players, it kind of rubbed salt into the wound that we were all now expected to support this team that was supposed to represent the whole country. And it just didn't look like it did, and it still had the trappings of the old, evil, oppressive representation of white supremacy. The 2007 Rugby World Cup final, which we won, was a little bit better. We had a handful more excellent players of colour in the team. Brian Habana is the iconic example, but there still weren't very many. And for many South Africans of colour who had started supporting New Zealand, the All Blacks, during apartheid, because they just wanted to support anybody but the Springboks, even after the 2007 World Cup, many South Africans of colour still refused to support their own national team. And then slowly, efforts to open up the sport began to bear fruit. More and more young black players who for the first time had been given significant opportunities to play rugby started to come through the training systems and be quite good, and then very good, and then the best that South Africa had to offer. In particular, black players from the Eastern Cape, Xhosa players like Siya Kolisi and Makazole Mapimpi. And suddenly, the debate around the Springboks started to change, because more and more people started to look at the Springboks and see people who looked, sounded, spoke like, and were raised like them. But still, the naysayers naysayed. And that is why the 2019 World Cup was such a transformative moment for South Africa. Going into that World Cup, there were still millions of South Africans, particularly black ones who didn't care about rugby, who didn't resonate with the Springboks. They needed a champion. They needed a revolutionary moment of a team of black and white players, and obviously colored also. I'm talking about everybody here. And they got it, because the Springboks won deservedly. They overcame and defeated everyone. And for the first time, the Springboks meant all of South Africa, all kinds of South Africans. So now in this 2023 Rugby World Cup, it feels so different, because the whole country, or at least way more of the country than ever before, is dialed in, locked in, and love obsessed with our national rugby team. That still has what is now a remade, re-understood representation from what it did for like nearly 100 years. And that is incredible. That is such a wild, weird, miraculous thing to happen. And it happens quite often in South Africa, where you look around and you find ways that this new country with its new energy and hope and vision have managed to transform really awful things from our history into having new symbols and new meaning in the present for a new generation of South Africans who are trying to make a different kind of world and country for ourselves. So that's the issue with the Springboks, how this excellent team that is remarkable in its ability to unite its fan base, a country together, is actually an extraordinary story of overcoming, of fundamentally changing and renewing an awful past and its symbolism into something that delights and inspires so many South Africans. Thank you so much for watching. This is The Issue with Dan Corder. We'll be back next week, as we always are, with a brand new episode. As we tell you, as always, South Africa is a movie. Come watch with us.